Konnichiwa Mina. It is now time for week 12 of the 2017 PFA season, the week of November 5th through 6th, as we're in our first week of November. So here are the standings as of week 11 last week. Cleveland still maintains their barely a half-game lead over Manhattan in its National East. Omaha still has a 4-game lead over Denver in the National Central. And Jacksonville has a 1-game lead over Birmingham in the National South. And Oakland has a 1.5 game lead over Hawaii in the National West. Pittsburgh has the quarter or half-game lead over Cincinnati in the National Century East. Oklahoma has a 1.5 game lead over Chicago in the Century Central. Miami has a 2-game lead over Dallas in the Century South. And then finally, Las Vegas has a quarter game lead over El Paso in the Century West. Only Milwaukee remains winless, and they're also the only team out of the playoffs at the moment. However, Boston can join them this week if they lose to Manhattan and Birmingham wins. So a Birmingham win and a loss to Boston. Lost to New York, Manhattan. Boston will be eliminated from the playoffs. But other than that, nothing changes. And then we look at the schedule for Week 12. As like I said earlier, we're finally in November for the first time this year. As first up will be Manhattan going to Boston, and then it'll be Cincinnati going to Columbus. That's the Century East on the line, believe it or not. And then it's Buffalo going to Dallas. And then a big Century Central showdown as Oklahoma visits Detroit, as Detroit wants to get their revenge from their blowout loss earlier this year. Minneapolis going to Indianapolis. Atlanta going to Jacksonville. That's going to be an offensive shootout. Chicago going to Kansas City. That's going to be a big Century Central showdown as well. Louisville going to Manhattan, and New Orleans going to Orlando. Then we get to the 4 p.m. games as Washington visits Birmingham in what could be a defensive slugfest. Las Vegas going to El Paso. That's going to be a big Century West showdown, as both that leads on the line between these two rivals. Cleveland going to Hawaii, Houston going to Miami, San Francisco going to Phoenix, Philadelphia going to Portland, San Diego going to Seattle, and San Antonio going to Tampa. And then we get to the Sunday night game, a big National West showdown as Omaha visits Denver. And then the big Monday night showdown between one of the biggest arch rivalries in the league as Pittsburgh visits Baltimore, which also could be a game that determines the lead in the Century East for the meanwhile. So we get things started with Manhattan going to Boston, as Boston's trying to avoid their first losing season, still trying to be in the playoffs, as Manhattan is trying to win 4 in a row. And of course, their starting quarterback, Jamie Norwood, is suffering a flu, so his backup's going to play in this game. So maybe Boston can have some luck, but they would not, as Manhattan would go on to win 24-15 in quite a close game. But Boston could not stop Manhattan's offense even without Jamie Norwood, as his backup, Gregory Hillard, in his first start was 15 of 27, 224 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had a great game. New York's wide receiver David Neto had 6 receptions, 131 yards and a touchdown. Their linebacker Juan Jones had 16 tackles. New York's defensive end Wilton Getz had 10 tackles and 2 sacks. And their other defensive end James Webster had 10 tackles and a sack, as Boston suffered their first losing season. And if Birmingham beats Washington later today, Boston will be eliminated from the playoffs. It's actually a hard-fought game for Boston, but they just couldn't pull it off in the end. Then we go down south a bit to Ohio, as it's a Century East showdown as Cincinnati visits Columbus. Whoever leads this game will have the lead right now in the Century East until Pittsburgh and Baltimore play each other Monday night, as this is a big game for both teams. And Columbus would win a defensive holdout 16-10 as they now lead the Century East. Oh my God, who would have thought that? As they were the worst team, tied the worst team along with Louisville last year, and they're 5-5 and now lead the division, as Cincinnati's now lost 1-5 the last 6 weeks as they're struggling. Cincinnati's linebacker Martin Jones had 10 tackles, and Columbus linebacker William LaFleur had 10 tackles and 2 sacks, as no offensive production really this week. So a big victory for Columbus, a tough loss for Cincinnati, as they're still in the playoff hunt in the Century East. Then we go down south to Dallas, as the Dallas Stars host the Buffalo Sabres in their rematch from earlier this year when Dallas went to Buffalo and shut out Buffalo. As Buffalo is trying to keep up in the Century East, as Dallas is trying to keep up with Miami in the Century South's division race, along with keeping up with Detroit to take the lead in the wild card round of the playoffs. Dallas would win it 16-3 as they now retake the 6th seed over Detroit in the Century Conference playoff picture, as Dallas's quarterback Troy Hill was 22 of 36 for 217 yards and a touchdown. Buffalo's strong safety Nathaniel Parker had 13 tackles, and Dallas linebacker Victor Shores had 11 tackles and a sack. A big win for Dallas. Tough loss for Buffalo as they're now dead last right now in the Century East. Then we go back up north to Detroit for a huge Century Central showdown as Oklahoma visits Detroit, as Oklahoma is trying to make their lead in the Century Central even bigger, as Detroit's trying to keep up with them and try and take over Chicago for the second place spot in the Century Central. And Detroit would dominate Oklahoma and win 34-13. Oh my God! As Detroit now takes the 6th seed away once again from Dallas in the playoffs, as Detroit's rookie quarterback Charles Cunningham continues to stun the league this year. 19 of 26, 297 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick, as he completely outplayed Peter Rose, who had a terrible game today. Detroit's wide receiver Joseph Chavez continues to have a dominant season this year. 6 receptions, 115 yards, and 2 touchdowns, as he's 2 touchdowns short of tying the record for the most receiving touchdowns in a season. And Detroit's other wide receiver, Floyd Lindsay, had 5 receptions, 140 yards, and a touchdown. And their linebacker, Kyle McCoon. All Detroit this game had 10 tackles. All Detroit in the highlights, as they had a dominant game against Orlando, as that was Oklahoma, as that was an unbelievable defeat Oklahoma suffered. Then we go down to Indianapolis, as we got pretty big out-of-conference showdown, as Minneapolis visits Indianapolis, as Indianapolis trying to recover from their tough start to the year after losing 3 in a row. And Minneapolis now won 2 in a row and still dead last in the Century Central, trying to catch up to make a playoff run. And Minneapolis would get the win in a defensive struggle as they win 23-20. It's pretty much all defense this game, as both quarterbacks did not really do good today. Minneapolis' wide receiver Alan Fernandez, 4 receptions, 110 yards, and their linebacker Eric Witt had 10 tackles and 6 sacks by Minneapolis, as their defense was rolling in this game. And with this win, they've won 3 in a row, as Indianapolis now lost 4 in a row. And then we go down south for a very interesting National South showdown, as Atlanta visits Jacksonville, as Jacksonville's trying to get their first winning season ever, as this is going to be an offensive shootout most likely. And in a wild shootout, Jacksonville would pull off the victory 35-31, as they had to pull off a comeback, as you saw, as Atlanta led 24-7 going into the second half, as Atlanta's quarterback Cody Perry was 14 of 26, 210 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. Meanwhile, Jacksonville quarterback Michael Winters continues to have a dominant season, 21 of 30, 313 yards, and 4 touchdowns! Are you kidding me? Atlanta's running back Kenneth Dixon, 13 carries, 125 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And their wide receiver Joseph Emims had 4 receptions for 128 yards. Jacksonville's tight end James Bennett, 6 receptions, 110 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And their wide receiver Emmanuel Gallant had 6 receptions, 102 yards, and a touchdown, as Jacksonville officially got their first ever winning season. So congratulations for them. A tough loss for Jacksonville, as they got, I think, swept by Jacksonville so far this year, as Jacksonville's getting closer and closer to possibly clinching a playoff spot. Then we go out to Kansas City for another pretty big Century Central showdown, as Chicago visits Kansas City, as Chicago's in deep trouble now. They've gone 0-2-1 after their 6-0 start, and now they've lost Matthew Smart for this next week or so, as his backup Robert Mullen, who's going to have to start against this game. And of course, he has not been doing good all in his career, so maybe this could be a shot for Kansas City to take down a week in Chicago to catch up with Detroit and Oklahoma in the Century Central. But that wouldn't happen, as Chicago dominated 28-7, as they scored 28 unanswered points after Kansas City finally got a point on the board. Oh my goodness, Chicago's backup quarterback Robert Mullen, best game of his career, 19 of 25, 259 yards and 3 touchdowns. And their fullback Jonathan Bradford had 4 receptions, 102 yards and 2 touchdowns. Kansas City's strong safety Virgil Coble had 11 tackles, and their defensive end Otis Linder continues to have a dominant season, 11 tackles, a sack, and a fumble recovery, as Chicago's defensive end Alfred Helms had 8 tackles and 3 sacks to have now 32 sacks on the season, As, like I said earlier, Chicago scored 28 unanswered points. What a dominant victory for Chicago. They needed that win. A tough loss for Kansas City sufferers. They're now dead last in the Century Central as they now lost 2 in a row. Then we go up north to Milwaukee as the winless Milwaukee Lakers host division rival Louisville Saints, as the teams completely flipped from last year, as it was Louisville around this time that had the losing record, winless season so far, as Milwaukee's still trying to get their first win, and Louisville, with Indianapolis' loss, would like to get a win here to get close to 500, still be in the playoff hunt in the National Conference playoff picture. But Milwaukee would prevent that and finally get their first win of the year, 14-7. Finally, Milwaukee finally got a win. No 0-18 now, as they're going to celebrate this until next week. Oh my God, that was a huge moralizing victory for Milwaukee to finally get a win. Although their quarterbacks got outplayed, as Louisville's quarterback Stanford Fink was 16 of 24, 175 yards, a touchdown and a pick, and their defense was really good. Their cornerback Doyle Bustamante had 11 tackles, and their linebacker Larry Mercier had 11 tackles and a pick. But in the end, it wouldn't make a difference, as their offense could not get an extra touchdown needed to force overtime, as Milwaukee finally got their first victory of the year, as this was huge for them. Then we go down south to Orlando for a Century South showdown, as New Orleans visits Orlando, as both teams are trying to recover from a terrible season, as Orlando, after starting off 4-1, has now lost 5 in a row, so they need to get this win badly to keep up with everyone else in that very competitive Century Conference playoff picture. And Orlando would finally get a needed victory after that 5-game losing streak, as they won 30-17, as New Orleans quarterback James Williams in the second game back had another great game, 19 of 31, 288 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick, as their Orlando's quarterback Milton Hester was 13 of 25, 141 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their running back Frank Evans had 22 carries, 116 yards and a touchdown, and New Orleans wide receiver Mark Madsen had 5 receptions for 101 yards and a touchdown. New Orleans linebackers were very busy today, as Keith Garcia had 13 tackles and a sack, and Joe Farley had 11 tackles, and Orlando's linebacker James Lyons had 13 tackles. So a very important victory for Orlando. Tough loss for the New Orleans, as they had James Williams back, but in the end, it just hasn't made a difference. And then we go down south to Birmingham, as we're getting ready for our 4 p.m. games in the rain too, as Washington visits Birmingham, as Birmingham's trying to keep up against Jacksonville in the National South. Washington's trying to catch up with Manhattan and Cleveland in the National East, as they now swapped quarterbacks, as backup Jose Burr from backup for Roy Rice is going to start, as hoping to get this offense clicking enough for their defense to get the win, as Birmingham wants revenge for not only that only loss they suffered this year, but of course to still get revenge for their humiliating loss in the divisional round last year in the playoffs. Birmingham would dominate Washington 24-10. Ironically enough, the exact same score Washington gave Birmingham in their division round playoff game, as Birmingham got the revenge. Washington's backup quarterback Jose Burr was terrible. 13 of 29, 306 yards, and 3 picks. The last 4 games, him and Roy Rice has thrown 1 touchdown to 10 picks. Oh my God, this offense in Washington is so terrible that their defense can't keep up with them. It reminds me a lot of Birmingham last year at the early part of the season, as Birmingham's quarterback Ollie Burke was 24-40, 142 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick, as Washington's linebacker Eric Donald had 12 tackles, and their defensive end Joshua Leyva had 12 tackles, and their free safety Michael Height was the only real scorer for the game for Washington, 6 tackles and a pick 6. Man, if only they had offense that could have helped out, they could have probably maybe challenged Birmingham better. And Birmingham's strong safety Jesse Browers had 4 tackles and 2 picks. What a tough loss for Washington, as they suffered 2 embarrassing losses in a row, as Birmingham's still trying to keep up with Jacksonville in the National South. And also with this win, Boston is officially eliminated from the playoffs. Then we go out west to El Paso, as we get a big Century West showdown, as Las Vegas visits El Paso, a big rivalry showdown right here, as it has the Century West on the line. And El Paso would get the win 20-13, as they now retake the lead right now in the Century West, as Las Vegas quarterback Keith Butler was 9 of 15, 173 yards and a touchdown. El Paso's quarterback James Febanobadox was 23 of 34 for 225 yards and a touchdown. El Paso's running back Allen Davis continued to have a strong season, 29 carries, 142 yards and a touchdown. Las Vegas strong safety Chris Dallas had 16 tackles, and El Paso linebacker Albert Corwin had 13 tackles. So an impressive victory for El Paso as they now take the lead in the Century West. Then we go out to Hawaii as the Hawaii Phantoms host the Cleveland Bulldogs, as both teams are trying to recover from a difficult stretch these last few weeks, as Cleveland has lost 2 in a row to Manhattan. Hawaii's now lost 3 in a row as they're trying to keep up with Oakland in the National West. In a stormy game, Cleveland would dominate in the second half as they win 30-14, scoring 27 unanswered points, as Cleveland's quarterback Scott Hernandez was 14 of 23, 261 yards and 3 touchdowns, as Cleveland's wide receiver Gerald Todd had 2 receptions, but 163 yards and 2 touchdowns off of them, as Cleveland's quarterback Manuel Echoes had 3 tackles, a sack, and 2 picks off that terrible offensive showing by Hawaii, as they now have lost 4 in a row, as Cleveland now recovered from their disappointing loss against Manhattan the last 2 weeks, as they retake the lead now in the National East for the moment. Then we go down south to Miami, as we got in a Century South showdown, as Houston visits Miami, as Miami's trying to keep up against Dallas in the Century South, as Houston is trying to look up after that disappointing loss last week. Miami would get the victory in a comeback 13-10, as Anthony McCormick did not really have a good game, but he won the game on a 28-yard touchdown run with just 27 seconds left in the game to help Miami stay 9-1, as Houston now lost another loss despite having an incredible game, as Houston's quarterback, who finally came back after a couple weeks away, Stephen Hargrove, was 23 of 32, 212 yards and a touchdown. And Miami's quarterback Anthony McCormick was 25 of 37, 241 yards and a pick, but that 28-yard run sealed the deal for Miami. Houston's running back Joseph Bolins had 25 carries for 103 yards, and Juan McKnight had 11 tackles and a sack. So Houston actually outplayed Miami and led for most of the game. It's just that they couldn't seal the deal when it mattered the most, as Miami got that very needed victory, as they're 1 game away from getting another winning season. And then we go out west to Glendale, as San Francisco visits Phoenix in their rematch from last year, where San Francisco actually came in and got their victory against Phoenix, trying to do that again as they were trying to recover for their 2-game losing streak. As Phoenix, oh my god, they're trying to recover from a 4-game losing streak they're suffering right now. And once again, San Francisco would get the win in a defensive struggle, 17-13, kind of like what happened last year, as San Francisco's quarterback John Getz was 21 of 33 for 228 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. San Francisco's defensive end Charles Magnuson had 13 tackles and 3 sacks as he continued to have an incredible season. Phoenix's linebacker Adam Hernandez had 12 tackles, and Aaron Stokes had 12 tackles and a sack. Another very disheartening loss for Phoenix, as they've now lost 5 in a row after they looked like so good at the beginning of the season. Then we go up north to Portland, as Portland hosts Philadelphia, which could be an offensive shootout against 2 very disappointing teams so far this year. Portland would get the victory 35-27, an offensive shootout, like I said, as Philadelphia's now lost 6 in a row, as Portland now won like 2 in a row, I believe. Philadelphia's quarterback Leroy Black was 17 of 25, 225 yards and 3 touchdowns, but Portland's quarterback Frederick Van Dyke was 23 of 29, 307 yards and 5 touchdowns! The 9th most passing touchdowns in a game! Oh my god, what a game he had! Philadelphia's wide receiver Everett Shapiro had 4 receptions for 27 yards and a touchdown. And Portland's wide receiver Ira Spencer had 5 receptions, 142 yards and 2 touchdowns. So what an incredible game Portland's offense had, as Philadelphia's now lost 6 in a row in a very disappointing season. Then we go up north a bit even more, as we got a Century West showdown as San Diego visits Seattle in the rain, as San Diego's looking a little bit better these last couple weeks, as Seattle's trying to recover from their 3 disappointing losses in a row where they almost had it but just couldn't seal the deal. And San Diego would get the victory 35-31 in an unbelievable offensive shootout, surprisingly, As take a look at this, San Diego's quarterback Ronaldo Schneider was 17 of 27, 281 yards, but he threw 4 interceptions, but he also threw 4 touchdowns as well, including the game winner with just 4 minutes remaining. My God, unbelievable. Seattle's quarterback Jody Tucker was 19 of 31, 207 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. San Diego's wide receiver David Seton had 4 receptions, 146 yards and 2 touchdowns. Seattle's wide receiver Eric Benjamin had 3 receptions, 123 yards and a touchdown. San Diego's strong safety James Stanley had 12 tackles and 2 sacks. Seattle's linebacker Melvin Jones had 12 tackles, 2 sacks, and a fumble recovery. And Seattle's free safety Hector League was very busy today, 8 tackles and 2 picks. So while San Diego's defense put a lot of pressure on San Diego's rookie quarterback, but in the end he managed to pull it off. What an incredible game that was, as Seattle's now lost 4 in a row after looking so good, especially considering the fact that all 4 of their losses, I believe, recently were within a score. Then we go down south to Tampa as San Antonio visits Tampa, as San Antonio is trying to keep up with Birmingham and Jacksonville in the National South. Tampa's just trying to recover from a tough stretch they've had these last few weeks. Tampa would win the game in back-to-back overtime games they had. Remember their loss in overtime to Oakland last week. They went to overtime this time around as they win it 27-24, as once again San Antonio just can't win in Tampa for some reason, just like they lost last year in embarrassing fashion. San Antonio's quarterback Glenn Chen was 15 of 23 for 298 yards and 3 touchdowns. Tampa's quarterback Philip Meechan was 31 of 45, 359 yards, a touchdown and a pick. San Antonio's running back Elvis Smith had 19 carries for 111 yards. Tampa's running back Edward Robinson had 23 carries for 106 yards and 2 touchdowns. 3 100-yard receivers in this game, and 2 of them were from San Antonio, as their linebacker Edward Garner had 10 tackles as well, and Tampa's defensive end Robert Hoskins was 19 tackles and 2 sacks, so as that gives him the 6th most tackles in a game this season. So, impressive victory for Tampa as they're still in the hunt in the playoffs, as San Antonio suffered another disappointing loss. Then we get to the big Sunday night showdown for the National Central, as the defending champion Omaha visits their rivals in the division, the Denver Miners, as we all thought this could be a battle on the line for the National Central. It still can be, but Omaha has a huge lead as Archie Marvin's coming back too, so that's really big for their offense, as Denver needs to win this game if they want to have any shot at competing in not only the National Central, but also to keep up in that very tough wildcard rounds in the National Conference this year. And Denver would get the win 34-28 as they finally have gotten their first lead over 500 this year, as they now won 3 in a row, as Omaha's quarterback Archie Marvin was 14 of 21, 297 yards and 3 touchdowns. Denver's quarterback Zachary Ellis was 23 of 32, 405 yards and 2 touchdowns, which gives him the 5th most passing touchdowns in a game. Omaha's wide receiver Stephen Carmona had 4 receptions, 171 yards, and 2 touchdowns, which gives him the 4th most receiving yards in a game. Denver's wide receiver Sol Hartman was also very big today, 4 receptions for 136 yards, and Omaha's quarterback William Victor had 10 tackles. So a very impressive victory for Denver, as Omaha tried to keep up, but they just couldn't in the end, as their 7-game winning streak finally came to an end, as their lead in the division has now been reduced to 3. And then we get to the Monday night game as we go down to Baltimore, as the Baltimore Charm hosts their arch rival Pittsburgh Blitz with the Century East on the line, as Pittsburgh's trying to win to keep up against Columbus. Meanwhile, Baltimore's trying to win to recover from their terrible start to the year and be competitive still in the Century East. And Baltimore would win it 17-10 in defensive struggle as they still remain undefeated at home hosting Pittsburgh. Baltimore's quarterback Andrew Lassiter was 25 of 33, 315 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. Baltimore's wide receiver Ariel Leary had 7 receptions for 130 yards and a touchdown. Baltimore's wide receiver Timothy Dawson had 5 receptions for 104 yards and a touchdown. Pittsburgh's defensive end Charlie Weber had 12 tackles, 4 sacks, and a fumble recovery, as he now ties Charles Mangusa for most sacks in the season so far at 32. So a very needed victory for Baltimore, as they're now within striking distance still of the Century East lead. A tough loss for Pittsburgh to swallow, though. And with that, the Week 12 games are in the books, as we now look at the updated standings. As in the National East, Cleveland still barely maintains their half a game or quarter game lead over Manhattan. Omaha has their 3-game lead over Denver in the National Central. Jacksonville still has their game lead over Birmingham in the National South. Oakland now has a 2-game lead over Los Angeles and Hawaii. How about that? Los Angeles out of nowhere, second place in division right now. Now Columbus now has a quarter game lead over Baltimore and Pittsburgh in the Century East. Oklahoma still maintains their lead over Chicago in the Century Central. Miami still has a game-and-a-half lead over Dallas in the Century South. And El Paso now has the game lead over Las Vegas in the Century West. As Boston now joins Milwaukee as the only teams eliminated from the playoffs. And now we take a look at the playoff bracket, starting off with the National Conference, as it's Jacksonville and Omaha still with the top 2 seeds, as it'll be Manhattan going to Cleveland and Birmingham going to Oakland still in the wild card rounds. As the top wild cards teams, contenders still in the hunt for the top 7 seeds, are very competitive and very close to each other. However, there are still no playoff elimination scenarios going into next week. Even Portland and Philadelphia, the worst teams right now, still remaining. They're still it, even if they lose and everything goes against them. And then we take a look at the Century Conference playoff bracket, as it's now Miami and Oklahoma with the top 2 seeds, as it's Detroit going to El Paso and Chicago going to Columbus. Oh my god, I still can't believe Columbus is in the playoffs right now at the season end of the day. Oh my god, that is just incredible. As the top couple seeds are still very impressive. Look at the top 5 teams in the hunt. All of them have over a 500 record. That is still unbelievable. And we have some playoff elimination scenarios finally in this division, as New Orleans, if they lose and a combination of either Dallas, Detroit, or Chicago winning, along with Oklahoma too, they will be eliminated from the playoffs. Also, Houston will be eliminated if they lose to Dallas, along with a Detroit, Chicago, and Oklahoma victory. They will be eliminated for the playoffs if that happens. And then we take a look at the schedule for Week 13, as we're going to get things started with a big game coming up. Omaha going to Birmingham. That's going to be sick. Phoenix going to Boston. Las Vegas going to Buffalo. Baltimore going to Cincinnati. That's going to be important for the Century East on the line. Washington going to Cleveland. Tampa going to Detroit. Dallas going to Houston. Philadelphia going to Indianapolis. Miami going to Kansas City. That'll be quite big. Jacksonville going to Milwaukee. That's going to be interesting. The best team against the worst team in the league. Portland going to Minneapolis. And Atlanta going to San Antonio for an offensive shootout. Then we go to the 4 p.m. games. Starting off with Louisville going to Denver. Columbus going to El Paso. New Orleans going to Los Angeles. Hawaii going to Oakland. And then San Francisco going to Seattle. And then we get to the Sunday night game. San Diego going to Pittsburgh. And then the big Monday night showdown in the Century Central Division, as Oklahoma visits Chicago. And with that, Week 12, is in the books. I can't wait for Week 13. All those incredible games coming up. And maybe at the end of Week 13, we can finally maybe start talking about some playoff clinching scenarios, So see you hopefully soon for Week 13 of the 2017 PFA season.